All right. Welcome everyone to the January meeting of our Early Childhood Investment Committee. This is a committee that we are reinvigorating in this fiscal year. But we're going to review the agenda in a couple of minutes. I would love to do a brief round of introductions because we have quite a small group. I'd like to do it verbally just to make sure that everyone knows who's in the virtual room, and then we can identify folks that we anticipate coming as well. But for starters, I'm Morgan Crossman. I'm the Executive Director of Building Bright Futures, and I am joined by Anna Brulette, who is our Policy and Program Director, and she's going to be the point for this project moving forward. Let's start with Dan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Winslow with Vermont Community Loan Fund. My official role is as Director of Business and Early Care and Learning. So that primarily is relevant here for child care lending that we do.
Thanks for being here, Dan. Eddie.
Hi, Eddie Gale. I'm with the A.D. Henderson Foundation, and I want to give a shout out to Margot that I can tell you by the end of the day, Thursday, what position your request will be in.
Awesome. Good news. Sarah.
Hey, Sarah Kenny. I'm the Chief Policy Officer at Let's Grow Kids.
Thanks, Sarah. Chloe.
Chloe Leary, the Executive Director of the Winston Patty Center in Brattleboro.
Thank you. Miranda.
Hi, Miranda Gray. I'm the Interim Deputy Commissioner for the Child Development Division.
Thanks, Miranda. Margot.
Hi, I'm Margot Holmes. I'm the Executive Director of the Springfield Area Parent-Child Center and the co-chair of the Vermont Parent-Child Center Network. And now I'm having a really good day. Thanks, Eddie.
Awesome news. Renee.
Hey everyone, Renee Kelly, Director of the Vermont Head Start Collaboration Office, which sits within the Child Development Division.
And Matt, if you're able to introduce by phone.
Yep, I'm Matt Levin, the Executive Director of Vermont Early Child Advocacy Alliance. I'll be here just, as I said, just for the first 25 minutes or so. And Dan and I are colleagues, are my parent organization. So I'll check in with Dan after the meeting just to get an update. So thanks, everyone.
That's perfect. And just as a reminder, we are going to record each of these meetings. It will be available to the committee moving forward. So, to start, I think one of the things that's really important for folks to know is that the Early Childhood Investment Committee actually is a long-standing committee or a longer-standing committee of Building Bright Futures. And we met just over a year ago in December 2020. And we were really at that time focused on thinking about this chronically underfunded early childhood system that we know to be true in Vermont. We focused on what different opportunities there might be for funding the early childhood system. And we also talked about where there were opportunities to see BBF as champions for this system and think about very strategically, what are the different funding mechanisms we should be considering to strengthen us as this backbone organization for collective impact for the early childhood system. And so, what we're looking to do in today's meeting is really reinvigorate that conversation and this committee and focus on some key changes we're looking to make under a HRSA grant that we received, a 5-year federally funded grant, really focused on developing and implementing innovative financing, health, and equity strategies to improve policies, service provision, and outcomes for young kids and families, specifically those in the prenatal to 3 area. But as we all know, much more broad as we think about the early childhood system, looking at prenatal to age 8. So many of you were members of this committee in the past, and there are also some of you who are newer members to this committee. And in the future, this will be a much larger group, including some of our congressional delegation and other both public and private partners, specifically looking at the Early Childhood Interagency Coordinating Team, so ECICT, or the public members or agency leaders who serve on the State Advisory Council. And their role is really critical to some of the work we're tackling as the holders of the finance data or their data stewards to be in this virtual space with us. But for today, we're really excited to share that in collaboration with the Vermont Department of Health, BBF was awarded that 5-year federal award from HRSA to really support our understanding of the complex early childhood system, specifically think about funding and mapping what's happening in our system, and identify needs and priorities that would help support our understanding of the needs for additional funding. So there are two key projects that we're going to be tackling this year that relate to the Early Childhood Investment Committee. The first is we're doing a systems asset and gap analysis. So for those of you who have been ingrained in this work, there were probably 6 to 8 early childhood or some type of needs assessments conducted in 2020. HRSA required another, and we pushed back and said, no, that's not the smart way to allocate funds. But what we'll do is a meta-analysis of all of these different reports and needs assessments and say, across all of those, here are the current and kind of consistent themes around assets and gaps that we see in Vermont's early childhood system. And then we're going to map that system and actually talk about this full list of early childhood stakeholders. So defining the partners, the websites, and the resources that are allocated to the early childhood space. The second project is the development of an early childhood budget. So, we've developed a really robust list of all the different stakeholders in the early childhood system as one starting point for developing an early childhood budget or doing some fiscal mapping. The other work that many partners, or at least a few of you, have been working on is a project called Aligning Early Childhood and Medicaid, where we actually did a robust compository of a bunch of not just early childhood partners, but also the resources and finances allocated across those different sectors. So we started this effort specifically around folks receiving Medicaid or resource allocation through Medicaid as a starting point. But the early childhood budget itself, as we're thinking about what that will look like, is really going to be used to identify all the financial resources dedicated to kids and families so that we can then be monitoring and aligning and leveraging financial resources. And that'll serve as this really unique starting point for our legislators, our policymakers, but also everyone in the BBF network to really understand what investments there are in the early childhood system across federal, across public, across private philanthropic investment, and use that to facilitate discussions about what's needed in the system. So I know that this scope of work is a little bit new for folks that are on this call collectively, but we've been talking about this with our interagency coordinating team, the State Advisory Council, and ECICT for the last couple of months. So folks are well prepared for this discussion. So what we've done to date is review early childhood budgets from other states. We've also reviewed the early childhood budget that was created by the Building Bright Futures team in collaboration with Public Assets in 2015. And we're going to use that as a foundation for how we think about building this budget. We're also working on a federal inventory. So looking across all of our departments and agencies, documenting and outlining the federal funds that have come into the early childhood system and using that to identify collaborative priorities. And so we've been doing that with the early childhood the early childhood interagency coordinating team as well. So this committee that's coming together today, and again, we're missing quite a few stakeholders, but this group is really going to be instrumental in supporting our process moving forward. And it's going to be about, in the next 6 months, publishing this baseline early childhood budget and using that then as a way to position us for potentially other federal rounds of support that we anticipate coming in. So again, we've had a series of federal resources over the last 10 to 15 years that focus on the early childhood system and systems building and sustainability, but this will allow us to really prioritize and see where there are gaps in our system. For those who may be newer to the BBF network, one really critical thing to know is that this is a role that we are named to hold in statute. So BBF is charged with aligning and monitoring early childhood funding and resources. And unfortunately, since 2015, we haven't had the funding or the capacity to execute this scope of work, which is really important, right? In this last couple of years, we've actually written to a range of different funders to give us the opportunity to build our capacity to actually meet this role in statute. So I'm really excited that we'll be able to recommit to this as a critical body of work that we are charged with in statute. And now I'm going to turn it over to Anna, unless folks have quick questions before we move into what this actual project will look like. Any folks have questions about, go ahead, Eddie, the process.
Just a quick question. In accepting the HRSA grant, were there any complications about what the implications of accepting that would be. And I refer to other federal grants in the last 10 years that the legislature was quite skittish about accepting.
No, it's interesting, actually. So I think what Eddie is referencing is that our legislative partners, specifically the Joint Fiscal Committee, had concerns about some of the larger federal grants like the Preschool Development Grant, Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge, and how they were awarded to the state and who was managing those grants. This HRSA grant was not under as intense scrutiny and did not have to, it was not required to go through the Joint Fiscal Office. So this was a grant that was awarded directly to the Vermont Department of Health, and we are co-leads at BBF of that grant. So we were instrumental in grant writing in those different components. It did not have to go through the same process as Preschool Development Grant. And actually, it's a really important flag, Eddie, that we've been discussing with our agency leaders, but also with the governor's team, that as those types of federal opportunities arise in the next couple of years, how we strategize in advance to make sure that we are ahead of any of those challenges and thinking about who should be the primary applicant and what that means.
Great, appreciate it, thanks.
Yeah. Other big picture questions about either the investment committee previously, what we're trying to do with this project before we dive into some of the nitty gritty and really engage you all in a discussion about anything we should be thinking about. All right. Go ahead, Anna.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you all too for your time. I'm going to launch into sharing my screen and showing some slides so we can talk about some of the details of the project, but want to make sure folks feel good about interrupting me or raising your hand or whatever it is if you have any questions, since it'll be harder for me to see you. Okay, can everyone see just the slides? Thumbs up?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So very quickly, I'm gonna dive into some of the details about the budget and kind of what we imagine in terms of formatting, and we'd love folks' feedback on kind of the pre-materials we sent out. We're also going to dive in a little bit to timeline and scope, although as Morgan pointed out, we need some other partners to be kind of part of that conversation as well. So that will be ongoing. And then finally, we really want to hear from you about, where this committee kind of will fit into this process, how often we should meet in order to inform the budgets, and some other things we'd love your feedback on. So this is kind of just roughly some of the things that Morgan has outlined. I will just say, I don't know if it's in this description, but I think it was highlighted in the agenda, and I want to call it out now again. We don't envision this committee meeting every month. We envision it meeting a little bit more on like a quarterly basis or as is needed to inform this project. So I just want to shout that out because I know folks are really busy and have a lot on their plates these days. We want to honor that. Oops. All right, so diving in a little bit more to the kind of what we see as the value of the budget. Beyond this being mentioned in statute, as Morgan pointed out, and that it being a really critical part of BBF's role that we really want to be able to fulfill in this baseline budget. It's also something I think folks have been wanting in the early childhood space in Vermont for a really long time. It's something that we hope will provide a better sense of the true scope of financing for early childhood programs. Also, beyond this baseline, we're hoping that there'll be some type of way we can sustainably do this project time and time again so that we can track funding over time into early childhood programs, and all programs serving young children and their families. And then finally, I think it is part of really thinking about like longer term, bigger picture thinking in terms of working towards integration, thinking smarter and harder about financing strategies and where things might be duplicative versus where we need more resources. Let's see, I see something in the chat. Okay, thank you, Morgan. Yes, yeah, slight departure, definitely some flexibility in the model. I don't know if anybody has any questions or things to add about where they see an early childhood budget being a valuable resource or document that will add to their work. Feel free to unmute.
Yeah, this is Chloe. I was really excited to get back, and I'll be interested to hear what work happened on this committee, sort of, and to get up to speed. But you know, having an understanding of the scope of what we're investing, just I think surfaces how important it is to align those investments and not have them working at cross purposes. And so to have a sense of that scope, I think will be really helpful in understanding not only what we're doing, but what's possible with what we have. Because I think there are a lot of resources, and are we really using them the best way we can? And so having a sense of this map, I think it's really exciting. So.
Thank you, Chloe. I agree. Anybody else have things they want to share when thinking about the value of an early childhood budget?
I'll just echo what Chloe said. I feel like this is something that policymakers have been asking for pretty much since 2015. Every year they're like, how much are we spending on early childhood? I'm like, well, we don't exactly know. So it's really exciting from that perspective. I'm curious as we dive into this more to think about how it intersects with the financing study too, which like this will be, the roundup of the current investments will be an important component of that. So I just want to think about how the timelines intersect there.
Great.
And I just wanted to share the clarification that I appreciated Chloe made, that this is a map and not a recommendation of a budget.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Addie. That's a really great clarification. Yes, this is a inventory of what is currently being spent. And I'll get into, I think in the next slide or the slide after, kind of also the timeline of that. We're thinking about a retroactive budget. So it certainly wouldn't be any type of, recommendation of a budget.
That's a really important clarification. Sorry, just one sec, Matt, that, the purpose of developing this budget is so that folks can use it to develop recommendations around where we have gaps, where there's alignment, where there are critical needs, what are we missing entirely, and how are we thinking about how we're using it to inform our decision making, right? So no, this is not the recommended. This is, here's what we know about what's currently or previously being spent in these areas. What are the opportunities? And then how are our advocacy partners, how is the State Advisory Council, how is the administration using it to think about resources and allocation? Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah. So it may be too late for this, but I would absolutely agree and echo that it may even be good to rename this thing, to call it a spending inventory. The budget has a formal technical definition, and it is prospective. It is forward looking. It has the flavor of a recommendation. If this is not a recommendation, I would call it. I would consider choosing a different name that makes it clear that it's backward looking. The other thing, just to know briefly, is, I'm sorry.
I just said that's really great feedback, Matt. And I think it's something that we should definitely consider, because we don't want there to be any question about what this is. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah. And my second point adds to that. I think it would be really helpful early on, and I don't want to make a whole lot of work for someone, but just to make it really clear what the parameters of this are. So the age parameters. I've done research myself on the different definitions of early childhood in Vermont. There are different ones. I don't care what it is, just what is it, right? And when we talk about quote unquote early childhood, how far along the policy set is this trying to reach, and trying to list it out? It may be hard to be comprehensive, but like housing is kind of murky. So how far does it go into that? Nutrition, etc. I think it would be helpful to have a box, kind of a pullout early in a document that said, so just to set the stage or set the parameters, this is what this is all about. I think that would be really helpful, and in making it clear what the intention of this is and what it is and what it isn't.
Great feedback, Matt. It's interesting. I like the way that you talk about the comprehensive nature of what this is, and the varying definitions of what early childhood might mean to certain people, right? So we're really talking about prenatal to age 8. What does it look like across a range of different sectors? But actually naming them is really important. And you, of all people, would not be surprised at what our massive list of all of the different partners, not looking at a budget, just naming all of the different partners and resources in the early childhood system and how robust that is, which is why we need to be very clear, I agree, about the scope and setting that stage right up front.
Agreed. I think that's a great point. And it gets even more, complex as we think about private investments and philanthropic investments, which is something we're hoping to dive into a little bit later in terms of folks' feedback on the scope and challenge of that and how that may or may not fit into this timeline for the baseline budget. All right, so I'm going to advance the slides, but again, folks can feel free to chime in. Okay, so the goal of this document is, and I, again, really appreciate Matt's point about it being an inventory, is to present a clear format and a clear report, but one that also includes a lot of information that folks have been wanting and really seek in their work to understand the true scope of the current financing of the early childhood system. And I think will enable us to track that better over time as well. Based on some of those preliminary conversations that Morgan mentioned with a variety of partners, we've been advised to really think about publishing a retrospective budget rather than one that represents the current fiscal year of spending. Our understanding is that this will be a lot easier from our public partners to actually be able to publish and give us access to this data in a timely manner. As well as kind of prevent some of the confusion around underspending here and reallocation here. I think it's just kind of a cleaner kind of narrative to present about spending, or not even spending, but really, although we could present spending rather than allocate, that's a whole nother conversation. But current financing for the early childhood system. I don't know if folks have feedback specifically on that point, because I think that's an important one when we think about the scope and framing of this project.
And I want to add one other component of why we're talking about using the FY 2021 budget versus the 22, which is the timing by which we need to have a baseline developed under the HRSA grant, right? So if we have to have a budget by the end of June 2022, it would be very problematic and incredibly challenging to have that final number and to have that fully flushed out. I think that the hope is that what we're doing in this year sets the foundation for a very clear, transparent process that is easily updated every single year. So in consecutive years, it won't be as challenging, but for this first year developing that baseline, we will be looking at FY21.
Great point, Morgan. Thank you. So in addition to kind of those being some of the goals or aims of this work, I think one of the things that has been implied, but we haven't necessarily stated, is that this also, I think, really helps us, really helps partners move beyond digging through terrible state budget documents or just really scattered state budget documents, and has one clear unified place for early childhood as a system, and also include some of these other additional pieces of data that folks really care about, but are often, not attached to a budget document itself, and really give us that additional level of data that I think makes the information around funding a lot more powerful. So population served, kind of a brief program description, and geographic area served are kind of some of the examples of what we imagine that looking like or entailing. Yeah, separate inventory for federal funding.
That's a great question. So just to give you a sense of what's been done to date through the Early Childhood Interagency Coordinating Team, ECICT, we have started to put together a much more simplistic version of a funding inventory. So how much funding has come in to our state across certain sectors for early childhood from the feds under CARES Act, under ARPA, and what were those expenses and allocation, not expenses, what were those allocations and what were the priorities within those allocations by department or division. So we've started that as well. But what we've realized is we need to keep them separate otherwise we won't be able to do that consistent fiscal mapping over time, if that makes sense. So for example, if we somehow develop a beautiful process by which we can pull data very easily in the same format and transition it into this template, if we are consistently competing with the federal allocations that are coming in, we won't have that standard process. That being said, it's really important for us to have that same inventory to be able to speak about the investment. And that'll be, again, a part of the conversation as we think about how we document private philanthropic giving and what that looks like as well.
Thank you. I think there is also an opportunity to really understand the gap better too, if you have those two categories, because I think my sense is, at least on a around here level, is that even with the infusion of certain federal supports, there are still gaps. And so understanding the percent gap with and without those federal infusions, I think is going to be a really eye-opening experience.
I completely agree, Margot. And it's really interesting, even just from a topic area, if we were to look at, for example, what the federal funding and those priorities and initiatives are, and what the state is saying is mapping to similar priorities, what are the gaps in the topic areas and what those funds can be used for, right? I think we heard a lot of those gaps, especially during the pandemic. So great comment.
I just clarify that. So it sounds like that's going to be a separate COVID federal funding inventory, but that we will be using, including the normal federal investments in this one, right? This isn't just state funds, it's also all the federal funds that are going. Great.
That's the intent. Yep. So Sarah, for example, IDEA Part C and Part B. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Or CCDBG funds.
Exactly.
Or, yeah. Okay,
yep.
great.
Great clarifying questions. Does anyone have any other thoughts about kind of our aims with the format? And then I think we'll transition into looking at an actual kind of proposed beginning of a format.
I have I don't know if this is the right moment, so I'll just put this question out there and then you can decide if this is the time to discuss it. But I've just been thinking a lot, as I know you all have at PBF too, about how we are disaggregating data related specifically to BIPOC Vermonters. And I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity here for us where it exists to identify if there are specific, like how our populations being benefited by, or like what funding streams are specifically targeted towards certain populations. Or I don't know if that's overly complicating things, but I'm just trying to think about whether there's any opportunity here to overlay that level of analysis.
I appreciate that, Sarah. I think it's a great point, and I think it definitely fits in. I don't think that that was the right time to mention it, and it's the right context to mention it, because when we think about these other pieces of information that feel valuable, that feel like a value add to this document, this resource, that definitely feels like an opportunity for us to think about whether it's within the formatting or within that program description, where we ensure that thinking about population served and equity and of access, that feels like the right fit.
Thanks.
All right, I'm going to head into the next slide, but again, feel free to interrupt. Okay, so this is the very beginning of what we envision, kind of the main body or table of the report, looking something like, and this is really based on, like Morgan mentioned, a couple of different things, both inspiration from other states that we think are doing this really well, namely Louisiana does this, and they do it a little bit differently in the sense that they are publishing an actual formal state budget document and a proposed and actual budget each year. So less of a retrospective spending inventory, if you will, and more of a budget. But we really admired their format and some of these additional columns that they have. And that is where we got those components. It's also partially based on what BBF pulled together in 2015 for that 2013 early childhood spending inventory. So we really want to think about, bringing in the best all those different models that we've seen. The data in here is very much just an example. It's based on what was in that 2015 budget that we publish. But the general idea is it's kind of this like stacked or merged table format in which you're getting both these key pieces of information about a given line in the budget, as well as the funding source or where the funding is coming from, and then finally the total spending. I think it'll be helpful to think about potentially how we ensure that state partners who are giving us this information or helping us get access to this information, how they are naming a program, and if there's any flexibility within that to make it something that is a little bit more understandable or a little bit more in line with folks refer to it often, whether it's in the State House or in other policy conversations versus kind of the fiscal or financial language that we see in the actual state budget documents. So that's something we've been thinking about, as well as, of course, this like short program description and how we kind of quickly capture or describe what a line item is actually doing and helping to fund. So I don't know if folks had, when reviewing this, either prior to the meeting or now, had any initial reactions to this. I know that it kind of takes a moment to orient yourself to the format, since it's kind of a funky stacked table, but I think it's one of the better examples I've seen of capturing all of this information into a more compact format. But I'd love to hear what other folks think.
Hey, Anna, it's Renee. Just throwing a thought here because I see the example on here was like Head Start Collaboration Office, which I wonder if it's worth also delineating to some point whether these funds are system level funds or direct service funds. Because that's really what stood out to me as I was even looking at the Head Start collab line, is like, well, that's money that comes in, but it supports the system. It actually doesn't directly serve vulnerable and low income families, right? There's a difference there in terms of direct service funding versus systems funding. And I think, for the folks who have been around for those Race to the Top and PDG dollars, we often hear that as like, whoa, there's so much money coming into the system, but we need more money in direct services on the ground. So I would offer that maybe another column or in some way where we're kind of breaking it down to that level so we can really assess how much money is going into the system versus direct service.
That's a great point, Renee. Thank you. I think, there's so many things we could add, and I don't want it to be too wide of a table, if you will, but I think that's a really critical one. So even thinking about some type of like color coding system or whatever it might.
I was just going to say color coding. Yeah, if you just do a simple color coding and then at the bottom you've got your colors and you're summing those totals. And then in other iterations of using the data, if folks want to dive a little more into that and do some pie chart breakdowns, I get all excited when I'm talking about how we're kind of visualizing and presenting this information. So definitely don't want it to be overwhelming, but I think something as simple as color coding, because that, when I think about who's using this information, how are we using it, that differentiation between systems level and direct service is I think, an important one.
That's great. I really appreciate that. And if you're excited about this, you might be lucky enough to be pulled into some additional meetings. Any other thoughts?
I get to sneak peek at graphs. Ooh,
yes.
What a fun afternoon.
Eddie, did you have thoughts or feedback?
Yes, I'm partly trying to figure out, is this table presentation supposed to be communicating something to me in a logical fashion? And I think in terms of, you read tables across in rows and up and down in columns. And so, for instance, that federal funds exist in every program name column.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have a clue as to why different sorts of funds are showing up in different columns.
Yeah.
As an example, there's potential here that the logic isn't communicating to me the way it's laid out.
That's fair. That is one of my concerns. So this is this is stolen from Louisiana and this is what they do. But you do essentially have to like trick your brain or like, kind of get over the way we typically read a table, which would be that you're essentially ignoring the header. So maybe it's, maybe we make that like the top column names less prominent, but you're ignoring those when you're looking at, the row that indicates the funding. So you're just looking at you're looking at Head Start collaboration, and the funds under it are just indicating that they're not at all tied to program name, short program description, etc. I don't know if that helps at all.
And I think that there's still some formatting. Like, I agree with you, Eddie. I think there's some formatting because, again, color coding, if within that program name, and then those general funds, federal funds were kind of all highlighted the same. I think there's some tricks that you can do that, but I agree. Looking at it initially is a little wonky, and it's something we need to pay attention to make sure that the message isn't being lost because folks can't read read the information the way we intend it.
I'm guessing there's something intentional here, and this is not telling me the way it might be filled out here. And the other observations we made earlier when we say building an early childhood budget, that we're not building it, we're mapping it, or whatever other metaphor we want to use.
I completely agree. I think I really like some of the terminology, either mapping or fiscal inventory, or, and we can talk about what that naming is. And Anna, I wonder if it'd be helpful in viewing this table. The way I look at it is as if we started in the Head Start collaboration box and looked to the right. And you don't look any further than under federal funds, right? So from the Head Start program, how much is coming from federal funds? As we're thinking about, the different grantees, how much funding is allocated to them? Is it coming from global commitment? What is the total amount allocated to Head Start? That's how I would read the program. Then, and that happens to fit within the Child Development Division. The next line down, childcare subsidy and employment training, like that's the same thing. It's the Child Development Division is receiving the funding for that, but then what are the different components of it? That's what's to the right. And then how the funds are, prioritized. Is it coming from the feds? Is it coming from the general fund? Like where is that funding coming from? Right. But I agree with you. The table itself it's tough to get there. So the question is, what is the best format to present this information? If what you're really trying to do is make sure that everybody has a very clear and transparent, here's the lead agency of who's receiving funds, whether it's federal, whether it's, state funds, if it's private philanthropic, what's the name of the program, what population are they serving, what's their priority or what they're trying to do, and where are all of the funding sources that support it and how much. And then right now we have another column called area or region served. That could also be, like they said, is it direct service or is it, right? We could have 18 columns here, which we won't, but what's the most important information that you all would want to see that would give you information to tell you how we are supporting kids and families in the state? That's what we need to land on, right? Like, what are those key pieces of information? Is it the areas or regions served? Is it the number of kids? Is it the, this is direct service or, systems work? What are those key components?
I'll just
I just jump in to say, oh, go ahead, Sarah.
Sorry, Renee. I agree. And when I looked at this draft at first, the stacked format was confounding to me a little bit. But I will say that when I looked at the Louisiana version, their full report, it made a little bit more sense, and it was embedded in.
Sarah, you're now muted. We heard the vast majority of that, but
I accidentally muted myself. So I just put the link in the chat in case folks didn't have it handy to the Louisiana study, because in the end, it looks like there's a bunch of text for the descriptions, and then it's just a line with the dollar amount. So that one was a little bit easier for me to read. And I totally agree that I like the idea of starting with the program name first, because when I looked at the Louisiana one, it was like pages and pages and pages of all the same agency, and you had to dig a line further to figure out. But if I want to know how much was dedicated to, early childhood special education last year, then I want to be able to look right to the first column for like special ed or whatever the program name is, as opposed to just here's the 30 pages of stuff that's happening through Child Development Division. I was also curious that in the Louisiana model, there are names with the lead agency for the contact person, which was interesting to me. And I don't know if I have an opinion because I think the contact people change with some frequency, but I liked the idea of having an individual, you know, within that department who's the, like, if you have questions about this line, here's the person to call.
Yeah, it's not something that we had finalized in terms of what would, like, how intricate we would get in, and I'm seeing what you're saying in the lead agency or contact. I do think it makes sense to have a lead agency, but I think one of the things that we're trying to figure out, especially in partnership with our state agencies, is this something, and right now it is something that BBF will continue to own and manage and monitor. And then we would hope that if there are questions about the budget, then we would make direct connections versus publishing each individual line item with a name and contact information, but that it's really something that we would then help facilitate through whatever mechanism, whether it's ECICT or the investment committee, versus having every single line have a name and a contact. But I do think it's an interesting thing to consider.
This is Dan. One last question I have on this is, who is this table's intended audience? Because that could affect how we format it. Like general public, I could see this being trickier to review. Obviously, the more time I look at it, the more sense it seems to make, but that's something to consider.
That's a great question. And it's so interesting because at BBF, generally speaking, our audience, our target audience is such a broad array of stakeholders. But to me, if we're really trying to understand the current impact of our fiscal decisions, then we want our advocacy partners, we want the state advisory council to be able to look at this and say, okay, we understand where there are serious gaps in funding in the early childhood system. We want our private philanthropic partners to be able to look at this and say, oh man, here's a clear opportunity where we can support initiatives because it's not funded under public or federal sources. We want our legislative partners to be able to say, oh, okay, we allocated X number of $1 million to the early childhood system in this year, and these were the priorities. So I think we want it to be a broad array of stakeholders. We also want it to be in as clear a format as humanly possible. And that is a complicated thing for something like this. But to me, it's folks who are making decisions about funding, right? Like this needs to be useful to the Child Development Division and the Agency of Education and ECICT to be able to come together and say, hey, 6 of these federal sources are going towards early childhood mental health initiatives. How are we thinking about our funding decisions based on that, right? How are we thinking about the allocation of resources? Or so much is being allocated for pre-K. I'm making things up now, but you see where I'm going with this, right? We're allocating so much in pre-K. What's happening in the prenatal to 3 space? And how are we thinking about this subgroup? Or to Sarah's earlier point, if we could get to the level of being able to document specific subpopulations who are accessing services or, you know, utilizing these resources, how would we think about those decisions? So Dan, that's an awful answer to your question, which is who's the target population? It's everybody on this call. It's folks making decisions about funding or making decisions about programs.
That's still helpful. Thank you.
Great. Well, we really appreciate everyone's feedback thus far. And certainly if you see, you know, other examples, either of other states doing this well, or even just like a different table format in a completely separate context that you think would work well for this, we would love to see them. One thing I'm being really mindful of is just, again, the wider we make this, essentially like the smaller we have to print it. And like, it would have to be a landscape report or document, which really getting into the nitty gritty there, but that's one benefit I see of essentially like you're basically like taking a wide table and stacking it, right? So that's one thing I really like about this, but would love to see other examples if folks come across them. So moving on a little bit, So to kind of return to our timeline that exists for this baseline budget, based on our grant as part of the BIP3 grant, that this is one deliverable of, we need everything finalized by the end of July. So our hope, since we are going to be doing most of the kind of behind the scenes work on this project as the BBF team, our hope is to have all of like the budget and program description data, essentially everything that you saw on that last slide, regardless of what format it lands in. All of that data we're hoping to have from agency partners, and any partner that ends up being involved in collecting that data by April 15th, to give our team plenty of time to kind of bring everything together, add some additional data visualizations and descriptions or whatever it may be, and finalize things by the end of July, knowing that it's a really busy time of year for everyone. Our initial thought is, and we'd like to discuss this further, but is to update this group kind of roughly quarterly and kind of continue to present you all with, drafts of that table and other components of the budget, and definitely gather, more substantive feedback based on hopefully what will be a filled in table or tables by May and June. And then finally, really thinking about this big piece that would, I think, significantly add or change the scope of work. But in terms of private and philanthropic investments, how do we capture or go about capturing that part of the system? And on what timeline? Does it make sense to include that in this baseline budget by the end of July? Or is that something we think about capturing in a different report in a different year? I'm really curious folks' thoughts on that. And to give a little bit of context or framing, we're vague enough in our application for the grant that we don't necessarily need to include that this year for the grant, but it's something we're really, conscious of and curious about and wanting to capture moving forward, certainly. So I don't know if anyone has any initial.
Anna, could you define private investments? For instance, is that parent tuition for childcare?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We thought about this too when it comes to like health insurance. Like, are we capturing anything beyond Medicaid and well, not Medicare in this case, but yes, I think that's a really good question, Eddie. I think it would potentially include private parent pay, but we're certainly talking about like nonprofits, advocacy organizations, private grants that are funding this work, anything within that realm. But in terms of like private pay, I think that's up for debate. That would be another conversation.
And because I wonder about philanthropic investments, I think of a rule of thumb, there's about $4 to $5 million in foundation philanthropic support for early childhood in the state of Vermont. And does that measure compared to the other amounts of money that we're talking about?
And I think
I would assume parent private is hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yep, that's a great point. And Eddie, I think that we, in the bigger picture, want to be able to capture and document all of those things. And the question for this committee right now is, what's a reasonable expectation by the end of July for this year? And then how are we building on it? Because I think that all of those components are really critical. And a part of this from a scope perspective is across all of our agency partners. I'm looking at, Ken and Miranda, recognizing that you may not be the finance managers and that you have your teams that are doing this, that we've already talked with in some cases. What is the current way that this information could be pulled from a system consistently, right? And how would we then get it from whatever that state is and translate it into the template that we are using? And that's a process, right? Because, for example, the funding lines will not always say exactly what that funding is or which group is receiving it. That finance output of data on the budgeting side may not give us all of the information we need on descriptions of programs, right? So it's there's some mapping that has to happen with this as well, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And that will have to happen, Eddie, whether it's the private philanthropic part or whether it's coming from our agencies across sectors. How are we taking whatever we're given and turning it into the template that we need? So that's just something I want you to be thinking about in terms of what barriers and challenges and things we might need to be thinking about related to the timeline and the scope for year one.
So if I can follow on that, is calling this a budget, is it a budget of public programs? Or is it a budget of everything that's done for early childhood, which would include private childcare?
The goal is that it would be a full inventory of early childhood across sectors, right? So it would include childcare, it would include all of it. It would not just be, here are the public sources that are allocated and across, right? That's the gold standard vision for what we want to be moving towards. The question is that a realistic expectation to get to by July?
No.
Exactly, right? So that's
But-
what we want from you right now.
Yeah.
What is the realistic expectation for July?
But it's not, and I think part of it is a definite, like, as Eddie's just pointed out, the definition is, like, we talk in lots of different circles about how the people working in childcare subsidize the system. Like, how are we going to capture that? I have no idea. So, but I think what we could do is at least identify the buckets or all the ways that we think, like, it's going to be actual dollars, and then, you know, maybe, as I said, people who subsidize the system, or, you know, how much money do we raise to even make, you know, to make it work as our organization. So that's, I think it's complicated. So I think we can name it, but I don't think that we can get that work done by July.
I agree. I think just the sheer volume of grants written by nonprofit childcare programs alone, let alone all the like parent-child centers and every other entity, I don't think there's any way to capture that in the next 6 months or 4 months or 3 months.
And I guess if we could possibly, though, make a guess and put it in perspective for if the target audience here is legislators or policymakers, their end decision is going to be, what do they have to do from a public policy standpoint to make our system work? So they're you know, they even if they have a rough idea that if they think, for instance, philanthropy is going to cover this, and then it's like, oh, philanthropy is 2% of what's needed, you know, that's useful information for them.
I appreciate that, Eddie. It's a great point. Some context, some like, here are the other resources that the system is relying on, and the context around how it's insufficient without advocating in any way.
Well, I think, right. And so that's what's really interesting. And I would love for folks to just, not right now, but take a look at the 2015 BBF budget that was put together to see what components of that you really like, because it did try to very broadly map some of those private philanthropic resources and grant programs. It was not the full comprehensive picture of every single thing, but it did try to put a larger number on what we know about what's coming into the state. And I completely agree. If we were to go to every single nonprofit and every group that is fundraising, as someone who did that in this last year and had to actually document that investment, it'll be really tough for every single group to say, yes, we wrote grants of upwards of $4.9 million to come into the early childhood system. Here's how much came to BBF. Here's how much went to early childhood partners. And here's how much we didn't receive, right? If we were actually successful in about 50% of those grants, here's what came in and what didn't. But how do you capture that from all of those partners who are not, again, state agencies who are collecting financial data and documenting it in concrete ways already?
Any other thoughts on this? We appreciate your feedback, because that's certainly kind of the direction we've been heading in terms of that being unrealistic, but it's nice to have folks double check us on that. And we get so excited about like the ultimate vision of what this can be for the state eventually and for our partners eventually, that it's nice to have a little bit of a reality check in terms of what's feasible this year. Okay. Well, with that, I'm going to transition to what I think is my last slide, and it's just some kind of discussion questions for our last half hour or so together. So we can take a look at this, and then I'll also stop sharing my screen so that we can all see each other. But in general, we would love love initial thoughts on the timeline. I think we're going to need, some more of those finance folks from the agencies involved in that conversation, but happy to hear all of your thoughts on that as well. And then we might just get into a little bit of a conversation around, again, like looking at that 2015 budget, if there are things you really like, if there are barriers or challenges that we want to avoid when presenting this information this time around. And I can bring up the other questions if we get to them, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now so we can see each other.
I've already forgotten those questions, Anna. I wonder if there's a way to pop them in the chat. I only read the first one before you took them down.
So the first question was around timeline, but yes, I will pop them in the chat. Thank you, Sarah.
Can I just throw out one other real quick request for a key of some kind for the different funding sources? I thought maybe I had an understanding of what you meant by special funds, but now looking at the 2015 report and looking at what lands in there, I'm like, oh, I have no idea what we mean by that. So if we could just define those, that would be great.
Great point.
I'd build off of what Margot's saying and say, in general, I think this document does really need a glossary or someplace that we're storing some shared definitions and what our shared assumptions are when we're working with this. And I did just take a peek at the last one. I will admit, I was like, well, it sounds a little outdated. Like, I don't know if there's going to be a whole lot there, but I thought it was great and had a lot of really interesting information. So I'll definitely spend a little bit more time with that. And I think overall, just the concept of trying to operationalize this in a way where it's easy to be done more routinely as opposed to having to like wait for public assets. I mean, when I look at this too, and again, if we break down and do a glossary in terms, right? So it's very, very clear. This is the great project for like interns to do, or, if we can really simplify the process and kind of document very clearly, what we're counting as apples and what are oranges and all of that, I think it will be easy to maintain going forward.
Along those lines, I think that my question is, how much of this project will this committee be doing, and how much are we informing the process? Because if the intention is that we're doing 60% of the actual work, that's a very different answer than if we are doing 10% of the actual work and mostly just informing and responding to things being presented to us. So I think that's a piece of it also.
10% informing the work.
Great.
And I say that to most of you, recognizing that you aren't the ones that are having to necessarily provide all of the data. So for example, right, having already met with Wendy Trafton and have a very detailed table that shows the program, the description, the funding source, the operating department, the target age, the eligibility, right? There is this need for our agency finance managers to be able to let us know what the current status of that data is. How is it pulled? And what will that look like when it comes to us? Will we, for example, Anna, myself, our policy team, Beth and Dora, as the people who will be the doers, for example, how will we know if a line is what it says it is? For example, I know for a fact that there's a line in the budget that says Building Bright Futures, but that doesn't come to Building Bright Futures, it goes to parent-child centers, right? So how would we, as the folks looking at what comes to us, be able to determine what the intricacies are around those funding lines and be able to accurately provide the descriptions? And so looking at what that series of conversations or meetings will have to be with either the finance managers who may or may not know those intricacies, or the policy people who know those intricacies as well. But no, we are seeing this committee as we want you to help guide us and let us know what is useful, what's powerful, how we should be thinking about it. What are the major things that we should be considering right now related to scope of work and timeline, feasibility, and, again, what level of detail is useful and how to think about it.
So can I say too, based on that level of detail question, for me, the lines of, general funds and I don't know, those seemed really in depth for me. And I think it is important to Dan's question about like who the intended audience is and like, what are we trying to say? Because I think it makes sense to break things down on that level if what we're trying to look at is, percentage of federal to state, or it's like, what, again, why are we using this information? What's it going to help us do? And so I just think that we can do more thinking about what those granular levels of information really are, because I don't want to make it so cumbersome that no one understands the process. And okay, great, well, we pulled what a special fund is, but is anyone really looking at that, or do they just want to know the overall total? So finding that balance where it's broken down on small levels so people can aggregate it or, put it together, take it apart is great. But if it's going to be to a point where it's overwhelming and burdensome and then no one's using that level, let's scrap it and kind of pull up a little bit and look at the bigger picture.
That's definitely the feedback we want from this group right now, right? We don't want to be creating work. We don't want to be creating something that's not useful, right? As you're thinking about how a document like this would be useful to you, what would need to be in there for you to understand the current system? And what would those breakdowns be? That's what we want you to be thinking through.
Just to play the devil's advocate, at least when I'm asked about funding, I think is it federal and it has a specific, you cannot change it purpose, or do you have general fund of which there is more flexibility and that can be moved? Because I feel like that's what a lot of times people want to know. What are the catches, and do you have to have so much general fund to couple with? I mean, I think maybe that is too much detail, like Renee saying, is like, what is the match and etc. But my experience is people want to understand what money has flexibility so that you could say like, oh, it is doing this, but maybe it could do that. And that's where people want to know about the federal funds versus the GF. And as they're looking to how can they use this in the future.
That's a really great point.
I am thinking of a barrier, and maybe it's because I think you were giving an example of where I'm like, oh, that's ours. I do think a barrier is like how we get this information, like how things are already coded, because just in my own personal experience thus far is like, when something is named for whatever reason, it's just really hard to get it to be renamed so you actually know what it is. As people come into positions and just say like, but wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. That's not what BBF is. Like BBF is not a parent-child center, and a parent-child center is not BBF. So why do we have these things intermingled? And we just do. But what I have been told is like, there's not a lot of changing that. And then I just also about the timing, because what I'm hearing is really a workload for our fiscal friends. And they too are just right now a little bit maxed out with, everybody has workforce crunches. And so I just don't know about the timeline of hoping that you all could get this information by mid-April, if that will be something that's feasible or not. But maybe. I'll remain cautiously optimistic.
All are really good flags. And having spoken with some of the senior finance directors, they have said that, pulling the information in one pass is one thing that can be done, but it's the follow-up around, okay, what does this piece mean? And how do we make the connection and the consistent meetings that may be problematic? So I think the sooner that we can have access to the full pieces of those budgets, right, in whatever form they are currently pulled in across agencies, that's important, because then we'll know how much work it actually is to get it from whatever that state is to whatever we want it to be. And I think that is probably the most important and critical component of the entire thing. My understanding right now, after talking with some of our finance directors and thinking specifically, Miranda, related to you all, Sarah Truckle and some others around, and folks in the secretary's office, that at the very least, everybody's using the same system so they can pull it. The challenge is then, how do you know the intricacies around the line item, and how do you take what you know about that line item and fit a description to it in the way that we're proposing in a budget like this, right? So yes, really important barriers and challenges to identify. What else are folks thinking?
Right. Morgan, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chloe.
Hi, Kate. Go ahead.
Oh, hey, hi, sorry. So timeline may be tricky, yes, for the Agency of Education. I'm still trying to get financial data for the NEAR report and to provide it to them, and I'm getting a lot of pressure. But anyway, universal pre-K dollars, are generated at the district level, right? With ADM and all of that and stuff. So there's no general fund. There's no appropriation from state for universal pre-K. So how I see that as that's not a federal flow through. That's not even a state flow through. That is, education dollars being spent at the local level. So that needs to be identified. We certainly have information about school districts expenditures for universal pre-K. And if we're going up to third grade, we would have that, of course. But I see here's the bucket of dollars, but I also see that needing to be teased out so that you do know, that so many of these dollars are for direct service delivery. So many of these dollars are for facilities, and operations. And so much of these dollars are for admin support and all that. So that can be really, really tricky. The idea B and C, federal dollars, those are flow through funds. We can track them. We have those are easier in my mind in order to support the budget. We know the number of children. Those are direct service dollars that are going to children across the state. So I want to make sure that, we could pull these numbers, but they are absolutely teased out and defined. So there's no misassumption as to, oh my gosh, there's $35 million being spent on universal pre-K or whatever. But what does that mean in terms of expenditures and expenses and all those pieces to support our children and families out there? So, but it might be like pulling teeth. So
Yeah.
Just putting that out there. I need to, take this and give Brad James a heads up and all, and those folks that do support giving us the reports that we need for the financials. So.
Absolutely. And Kate, I recognize how hard your team has been working to try to get that data around the fiscal mapping for pre-K for the NEAR report. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree. I think that one really interesting piece that Anna and I are going to have to consider is what goes into what we build as a base and what goes into a massive limitations section in year one for what it means to actually build something like this and all of the intricacies around it, right? So actually documenting these barriers and limitations, not just around timing, but the challenges around how complex some of the funding is. We just heard what it meant for pre-K, but even though, for example, we receive federal funds for IDA Part C or early intervention, what does that mean in the context of children's integrated services? How do we then have footnotes across 8 other pieces that talk about how these funding sources are related or tied together, right? It's not as straightforward as just spitting out budget lines and being able to publish a table, right? There are a lot of complicated components to this, and we want to be thinking about those barriers now. Thank you, Miranda, and thank you all for being here. We'll definitely be in touch around this. And again, our agency data stewards and our agency partners, I really appreciate you being here. And this being now the third time that you're hearing us try to talk through what this could look like, because I know you've been a part of those conversations. So thank you.
I was going to add, hearing the question about and thinking about what is this, how is this useful? Like on the most macro level, are we spending, what are our resources and are we spending them well? So there's that tying that to outcomes as much as possible. But when I think in those broad terms, I think all of Kate's points and other people's points about let's make sure we understand how the money is being spent. And if we can't get the exact data, what's good enough? What are the broad brushstrokes? If we're putting so much into actually looking through that 2015 report, when you see how much AOE is putting in then versus all the other rest of the money we're spending, that's so interesting. I don't know what to make of it, but I think even understanding on a really broad brushstroke level at this level would be helpful. Does that make, I don't know if that makes sense, but I guess I worry about we could get really caught into the pennies. I know we wouldn't, but we could. And that's not necessarily, is it good enough? Do we have enough information? And then I think the other thing I just want to push back on is let's make sure if somebody tells me, oh, we can't do that because it's, Miranda, you were saying there are definitely programs that are very locked into what they need to be. And sometimes I wonder if that's just been, I know that's very true, with Medicaid and federal dollars. And sometimes if you keep asking questions well, we're not really sure. So I think I would encourage us to keep asking questions about our assumptions about what some of our conclusions are about how the money's being spent, if that makes sense.
One thing real quick, in thinking about, high level intention, to capture as much as possible that is the federal government, non-state government support, to show, that there is a gap there and that there's only so much money there, that could help policymakers, just from the point of view, if it is not defined, then it leaves it open to interpretation that's being taken care of elsewhere. We don't need to worry about that sometimes if you don't answer the question. And the other point I wanted to follow up on that I think Chloe had raised was in regards to how much is being balanced on the backs of existing providers. There are some ways that you could explore to quantify that. There would never be ready for April, but there are some, I can kind of turn the wheels in my head, I can think of some ways you could try to gather data and classify that, and that could potentially be useful on a longer term basis.
Right, or make a really interesting addendum to the budget, and you could easily extrapolate the differential between what people are being paid and what they should be paid. I just wanted to raise the question when we're talking about funding that's very closely moored for a specific purpose, is that, are we going to create anxiety for the funding that is not moored? In that if money is funding someone to do something and it becomes there's a spotlight on it, that that could be used for something else.
Right. So what are the unanticipated consequences of potentially putting out this information, and how are we very intentional about talking about this funding, right? Because I do think, and specifically from a CDD perspective, that is often something that is targeted. Well, if you have discretionary dollars, what does that mean? And how is it used? And could it be used in other ways? And I know that also happens with our education partners related to the Ed Fund, right? When there are either misunderstandings or a lack of understanding about what funding can or can't be used for, I think that's where we struggle. What else should we be thinking about? This has been such an important conversation. I really appreciate you all taking the time to do this, because we want to build something useful. So if there are other things that don't come up in today's discussion and that you think about as you're doing something else, please flag them for us, because we want to do a great job at this next pass. We could just have replicated what was done. We don't want to do that. So how do we build something that's truly useful? And what else are we missing as we're thinking about this?
So what you're missing, but looking back at the 2015 report, it sort of seems like that was a combination of what's now the state of Vermont's children with the budget, right? So I'm assuming that for the purposes of this, we just want to be looking at the appendix, that's the budget breakdown, right? Because although I think some of the other context setting data in there is really instructive, but was definitely more sort of what the funding achieves and doesn't achieve, as opposed to just here's the inventory of where the money is going.
Yes. So we definitely want to be scaling back the amount of the outcome data or the narrative in the front, but we want to have enough that's still useful, right? So some of our state agency partners, not all of it, but looked at some of that and said, oh man, okay, we didn't realize that that narrative was connected to some of this and that informed how we thought about the numbers. So I don't want to lose too much, but I also, again, we're not trying to replicate state of Vermont's children. And this report, the first, I think, probably 26 pages were more of that narrative. Here are the outcomes associated. But again, we want to be thinking about what really worked well and what people liked from that report and didn't.
Yeah, I'm always in favor of contextualizing budget information for people as much as we can, because people want to make meaning of it, right? So maybe it's just references embedded in the report to the state of Vermont's children, like to see the outcomes of how these funds are impacting Vermont's children, refer to them. I feel like I liked that there were so many introductory slides of like, here's what we're getting. And then here's the specific money that's flowing in.
Right. One of the differences that I do see is that all of the charts and graphs related or built into the 2015 budget weren't necessarily from the state of Vermont's children. It was more about the funding components, right? And I think there's only really one place in the state of Vermont's children where we have the basic needs budget and a table referencing that, but it's also still too much. Even still, it's too much in the front section of this report. So I'd love to hear from folks as you're looking back at that, what is really valuable. For example, the percent of the budget that is dedicated to early childhood. For me, that's amazing to know that 15% of the overall budget is what's dedicated to early childhood, those types of stats and figures. But what are those for you that you'd want to see pulled out and stuff, some of this as well?
Yeah, I'm sure I saw this when it came out in 2015. I hope I did. And it's actually, I'm noticing it's the FY13 budget. So that's so interesting. It's so old at this point. So I definitely want to spend a little more time with it. I didn't look at it before this meeting. So I think that and the Louisiana report, which I also haven't seen, which I think, looking at those and trying to come up with some things, I can certainly do that, in between meetings or send it separately. But the graph that I did look at was, where is the money coming from? So again, that one on, it's like slide 13, I think, the Agency of Education and how, where early childhood funding is, and that surprised me. So that seems interesting, like the sources of, like, where is it living, and then what does that tell us about how it's being spent?
And that was before UPK rolled out, because that was the 2013 budget.
So I will just throw out that I think even if our role as a committee is a level of informing and discussing, if the goal is July, meeting quarterly means that we'll have one more before we hit July. So not to put more on everyone's plates, because I'm just busy as everyone else. I think that if we met a little more frequently than that, it may help keep things kind of moving forward and keep things on track. And I'm with Chloe in that I don't know that we'll necessarily hit that deadline, but then we'll have an understanding of where we are at, and are we, how far into the project are we as we get closer to that. So maybe it's every other month instead of trying to get monthly on everyone's calendars. But I think trying to meet quarterly, there's only 2 quarters left before July, and this is one of them. So that's my only concern in terms of frequency of meeting.
Yeah.
The other important role for this committee is the then what, right? So we're going to develop some sort of baseline early childhood budget with a range of limitations. The limitations will probably be bigger than the budget, but right, we will have this documentation around what we know about this inventory. And then it's also the responsibility of this committee, as well as the State Advisory Council and ECICT, to then do the next step. So what do we do with this information? And this committee is very small, mostly small intentionally right now as we're building this inventory. But then we do want to be engaging our federal delegation and others in this early childhood investment committee to say, how are we talking about this budget? How are inventory? I will shift my language, I promise. How are we using it? What's the plan? How are we talking about it? And how are we being ambassadors for different components of it, so that we are not just creating something that then sits like the 2015 version, right? But I agree, Margot, we didn't want to overly burden this committee, recognizing that you all are very much so invested in having a final product that is really robust and intentional, but also not overkill. So this is something that our team, regardless of how often this committee meets, will be prioritizing and working on, and reaching out to meet with each of those agency finance managers as well. But I'm happy to meet more frequently to keep folks apprised of what's happening and to ask additional questions, but also to have you provide feedback on the current status.
Even if it were every other month, that might only add like 1 additional meeting or 2 additional meetings.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, related to title too, I agree that it's funky to call it the early childhood budget broadly. I do think having the word budget, like just calling it an inventory, is going to confuse people, I think. So it could be like a budget analysis, or budget like 2021 budget analysis, early childhood 24, or something like that. I agree with the sentiment that we don't just want to call it like a budget that we're putting forward for people to, weigh in on. And I want people to understand what it is. Yeah, fiscal inventory, I don't know for lay people if that's going to make sense to them what they're looking at. But
that goes back to the intended audience question. If you call it fiscal inventory, that's very much a technical term.
So we'll continue to be open if folks have other ideas over the next couple of weeks around the title, around other concerns, other timeline implications, other things that we should be considering. Please send them directly to Anna. And, for those who have not reviewed either the Louisiana version of the budget or the 2015 budget, any comments you have around what you really liked or you want to maintain, or any questions you have about either of those would be really helpful as we think about building this. But our next steps are absolutely to be connecting directly with the agency data stewards to, at the very least, be able to, at the highest level, pull down the public sources of funding, and then starting to map and try to disentangle what that looks like to get it into a template that's meaningful.
All right. Thank you all for your time. Any final thoughts or things to share? All right, as Morgan said, my inbox is open. I have to give Margot a shout out because she already sent me a mock-up of another template that could potentially work even better than our stacked version that we showed you. So perhaps I'll work a little more on that and send out another thing to get folks' thoughts on. But we really appreciate everyone's time for this long meeting on a Monday afternoon. And we'll be in touch about maybe scheduling something on a every other month kind of basis to keep folks in the loop about our process.
Hey, thank you for bearing with us.
Thank you.
all.
This
Great,
is
super exciting.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Dan.